Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. I'm so glad you're here. And what I have here is a cheap plastic clock that I bought at Target for $5. And it works fine. I've dropped it about 1,000 times, so it does have a chip in the rim, but it's not even really visible. The reason I'm going to craft with this clock today is because a friend of mine bought an identical clock and decided they didn't want it, so they gave it to me. So I'm going to replace this clock with the new clock, and I'm going to craft with this clock. So the first step is to take it apart. This clock, the back of it is attached to the plastic with the glass insert with some little screws, so I'm just going to unscrew it. And then you have the clock mechanism, which you can see takes a single AA battery. And that's got some clips that are holding it in place, but then you've got the hands on the front. So what I need to do is take the hands off, and then I can pull this back piece out of the clips. And I wasn't too sure how to take the hands off. I didn't want to break it, but it turns out I could just basically pop that second hand off and then pull the other two hands off. And now there's nothing in the front that's preventing me from removing the mechanism in the back. And so now I have my clock mechanism, and then I have the clock face and the plastic and the glass, and I'm not going to craft with those. So here's the sort of haul from this. And those two black plastic circles are what were holding the new clock into its packaging, and they've got black screws that they were screwed to the packaging with, so I am actually going to use those black screws as well. Now, what I have here are two items from the Dollar Tree. The first thing is this round circle of thin wood, and that was $1.25 at the Dollar Tree. I did buy it a year or two ago. And then I also have this pizza tin, again, $1.25 at the Dollar Tree. We were actually using that for pizza, but I'm going to use it for my clock. Can always replace it. The piece of wood is called hanging decor, and you can get it in the crafting section. And this circle of wood fits perfectly inside the pizza tray. So I was wondering how I could get a sort of metal rim, and this just presented itself as being a perfect fit. So my inspiration for the look for this piece of wood is one of those old industrial spools. So I'm going to age and paint this wood to look like an industrial spool, but of course it's also going to have the clockworks going through it. So the first thing I'm going to do after removing the hanging part of the piece of wood is find the center of it. So I traced around the wood onto a piece of paper, cut out that circle, and then folded it in half twice to find the center. And I'm going to use a compass, so I'm going to poke the sharp part of the compass through the center, and then I'm going to use the compass to draw a circle as close to the edge of the piece of wood as I can and measure the distance from the edge. I thought that my hole wasn't exactly in the center, so I adjusted it a little bit. I do, because this is a clock, I do want it to be as much in the center as is physically possible. So then I just adjusted that center a little bit. Now, with the clock mechanism, it's got a little stem that sticks up, and that's what the hands are going to fit over. That whole thing needs to come through the center of my piece of wood. So I tried with a 1/4-inch drill bit. I ended up needing a 1/2-inch drill bit. So I drilled a 1/2-inch hole in the center and then confirmed that the clock would still work, like that there was enough distance, because the piece of plastic that, or it might be metal, that the original clock was made of is quite thin, and this wood is a little bit thicker. So I did confirm that the clock would still function through this hole. And now the fun part, I want to make this look like an industrial spool. So those are usually made of boards. The top of the spool are usually made of boards. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw some lines on this where I want those boards to be, and I don't want them all to be the same size. And then I want to cut where those lines are. I want to cut a sort of channel at each line so it looks like they're separate boards. And you could simulate this with paint. You could just paint a very dark brown or brownish black line there. But I wanted to give this wood some texture. So what I did was I cut straight down with my box cutter knife, and then I cut at an angle about a 1/4 inch away from that line into the line, and that allowed me to lift up a strip of wood that is very thin, but that is where that line is. So I did that for all of my lines between my boards. And then if you look at industrial spools, you'll see that there are some rivets around the center hole, I think. I've never actually seen an industrial spool in real life, close up, but I think they must be holding that center, the top to the center of the spool. So I drew a circle around my center hole with my compass, and then I drilled 4 holes around that. And these are a little bit larger than those holes that were at the top that the piece of twine was through for hanging. I'm going to leave those holes because I'm going to drill more holes in this spool just to make it look aged. Now, I believe I made a mistake when I drilled the 4 holes. You can see that I did not drill them in any way aligned with my board lines. And I did that intentionally because I thought it would look better, but it made it more difficult to put this clock together in the end. So I would recommend when you drill these holes, drill them so that they are aligned vertically or parallel to your board lines. Now those drill holes, the ones that are around the center, those are going to be functional. We're going to use those to attach the pizza pan to this piece of wood. These other holes that I'm going to drill are not functional. Most of them are not going to go all the way through, but I'm going to use a smaller drill bit and drill a few more along the rim just to sort of make those 2 holes that originally had the twine through them not look so weird. So, oh, sure, there were a lot of holes around the rim. And then just some smaller, more like divots. I'm not going to go all the way through, all throughout the piece, which are to simulate nail holes from nails that were in this wood. So assuming the top of your spool is some kind of repurposed wood that had been nailed, I'm just going to drill some holes in it for those nail holes. Now I want to then give this some grain. Again, I should have done my lines with the grain of the wood. This wood has very little grain, and ultimately this was not a problem. But just to be consistent, I think I should have done everything with the grain of this wood. What I have here is a wire brush, and I attempted to brush over this to get some grain. It works really well with insulation foam. It does not work well with wood. So what I ended up doing was taking my box cutter knife and just dragging sort of wobbly lines down each board to simulate the grain of wood. And once I had finished with my grain and drilling all of my holes, I just took some sandpaper and cleaned up mostly those drill holes and where I cut the channels to look like the boards were separate boards. And now the really fun part, which is the paint. So I'm going to start with those lines and the nail holes. And I've got some apple barrel burnt umber and black, which I'm mixing together, but it's mostly black. And I'm going to paint that in all of the lines, which are separating boards, and in all of the divots, which are supposed to be nail holes, and the actual holes that I've drilled everywhere. And then spray it with water, and always pick this up and hold it in the same orientation. So I'm going to put a towel under it, spray water, and tip it towards me, but always with the same part down, so that I get a running effect, like you would with if you have nails in a piece of wood and they rust and it rains, then you get a sort of dripping effect, which goes down from the nail towards, gravity pulling it down towards the ground. So assuming you had your spool in a particular orientation and it sat out there a long time, you would get the rust all going in the same direction. And I'm also using a towel just to sort of wipe that and just until it looks realistic to me. And now I'm going to follow my usual process for making aged wood. Now the gray that I have here is pewter gray. It's a nice dark gray. and I'm going to water that down and wash it over the whole piece. And with that done, I'm then going to dry brush burnt umber all over the piece. So around the edges, in towards the edges. And if the brush marks looked too brushy, I just rubbed them with the towel so that they looked a little bit more blurred. Once I had brushed that over the piece, I then watered the burnt umber down and washed that over the whole piece. And when I do this, I make sure that a little bit of the gray underneath isn't covered by the brown. So I do most of it, but I do let a little bit of that gray come through in places. And ultimately, once it had dried, I decided it was still a little too light. So once it dried, I did give it a second coat of the brown. But that was after I had already put the piece together. It's better if you do it now. Once I put it together, I just didn't like the way it looked, so I brushed another coat over. Now, I'm so sorry, I don't know how I missed recording cutting out the center of the pizza pan, but the piece of wood is going to go on top of the pizza pan, and that would be too thick for the clock mechanism to come through if I only drilled a hole in the center of the pizza pan. So I basically need to just cut out a square in the back of the pizza pan for me to put the entire clock mechanism, which is a little, well, squarish shaped rectangle, in the back. So that's going to go right up onto the wood. The pizza pan won't be there. So all I did was drilled a hole in the pizza pan, and then I used my Aviation snips to cut out a rectangle. Well, I traced around the clock so I knew the size I needed, and then cut out with my Aviation snips. It was not hard to cut out. This is pretty thin metal. So what I'm doing right now is I am sanding it so that I can glue to it and so I can paint it. And there are lots of options here. So after I sanded it and wiped it down, if you watch my channel, you know how I love rust. I decided to give it a rusty look, but there's lots of options. I feel like the pizza pan itself is just a little too fakey looking. Even sanded, I don't love the way it looks, but you could leave it that way if you like the way it looks, or you could paint it any color, because industrial metal is painted, or maybe you don't even want to do an industrial look. You could paint it white. But what I'm going to do is give it some rust. So I'm going to start with orange. So this is Apple Barrel Harvest Orange. And I'm just going to dab that all around the edge and a little bit on the inside, because you will be able to see that sort of inside lip in just sort of blobs that I think look like the way rust would look. So definitely on the edges, but in the middle in places too. And then once I have the orange, I'm going to put brown over that. And this is Apple Barrel Burnt Umber. And I'm dabbing, but you also want to brush it a little to soften it, and basically dabbing that over the orange and letting the orange show through completely in places. And I don't know if this is entirely necessary, but I have a yellow here, it's Apple Barrel Sunny Day, and I have a red, it's Apple Barrel Bright Red, and I'm just putting tiny little highlights of the yellow and the red, really very little, but if you look at rust, it does sometimes have these like yellow and red bits, so just adding tiny little dots of that. And I think that looks fine, especially if you like that color of the underlying pizza tray. But because rust is usually eating through metal, I wanted to put some gray over it. So I'm putting a really light coat of the pewter gray over all of the areas that you'll see. So the rim of the pizza tray and just on the inside and then around the outside edge of it, and dabbing it if it's too heavy. And I'm not covering up the rust, but a little bit covering the edges of the rust. And then because that second hand is a bright silvery color, the hour and minute hands are black. They're okay, I think. I'm just dabbing a little bit of brown on this second hand and a little bit of the pewter gray. I don't want to make it heavy. I don't want to interfere with how the clock works, but I just wanted to dull it down a little bit. Now I did sand that place on the inside of the clock where I cut it, but it's still kind of sharp. So this is not the best, but I'm just going to take a little bit of duct tape and duct tape over that sharp part in the center. And now I'm going to use clear Gorilla Glue to glue my piece of wood to my pizza tray. So with clear Gorilla Glue, you mist one side with water and the other side you put the glue on. So I misted the tray with water and I put the glue on the piece of wood. And then I clamped that together and let it dry clamped for several hours. I think the container says 2 hours. Follow the container's directions. This is not the only way this is going to be held together, but I thought it was a good start while I was continuing to work on it. And you can see the wood is pretty light. You might like the way that looks. As I said, I added just another coat of watered down burnt umber over the wood, but it's harder to do when it's connected together like this because I didn't want to get that on the pizza tray. So with that all dry and painted, the next thing I did was give the pizza tray and the wood a coat of matte Mod Podge to seal the paint. Now, I thought a lot about how to connect the clock to this, and I decided to just glue it to the back. So again, I'm going to use the clear Gorilla Glue. So I'm applying the glue to the clock because I didn't want to spray the clock with water, and water to the wood, and then just doing my best to get that centered and glued in place. And then what I did was I put some matte Mod Podge containers on top of that, and then a pile of books on top of that in lieu of clamping. Now what I want to do is put some wood on the back now that that's all dry. And I'm going to screw through those holes that are around the center and screw them into the wood on the back. This is why it would have made much more sense for me to align everything vertically. But I didn't, and it's going to be okay, but it's not perfect. So I'm just going to use some paint stir sticks, and these are the larger ones, the ones that come 3 to a package at Home Depot. And these are scraps from other projects. So I'm going to put them on 2 deep so that they are basically flush with my clock. And I'm going to put one on either side of the clock. So I'm going to glue them on, and then later I will drill into them. So the first thing I'm going to do is just measure and cut them. And then I'm gluing the 2 wood pieces together with wood glue, but then I'm using Gorilla Glue to glue the bottom piece of wood to the tray. And with those glued on, I'm now going to drill through those 4 holes, and I'm going to use those black screws that I had, which had attached the new clock to its packaging. I only have 2 of those, so I'm going to put 1 black screw into each piece of wood, and then I have some black carpet tacks, so I'm just going to nail those through the other holes. And I'm sinking those also, they're below the surface of the clock. So now I just put my hands on my clock and put a battery in to confirm that it's still working. And you can see I used duct tape to secure the wood to the back of the tray because I couldn't clamp it. I didn't have a clamp that would reach that far. So now it's time to think about the numbers on the clock face. And there are different options here, of course. You don't need to have numbers at all. There are definitely clocks that have no numbers. We all know where the numbers are supposed to be. Or you could spray paint or simulate the look of spray painted numbers. And here's an example of what that might look like in Photoshop. I think that would look really cool. But to be honest, the whole reason I wanted to do this project is because somebody was selling letterpress letters on Facebook Marketplace. Here's a picture of what they were selling. And I was really inspired to do something with letterpress letters, which to me would be an industrial project. So I want to make some faux letterpress letters and use those for the numbers on our clock. Now, the big question I had was, do I reverse them? Because these are used in printing presses, so they're reversed. And I tried it with them reversed, and I just thought it looked too weird. So these are just an homage to letterpress letters. They are going to be facing the right direction. So what I did was I found different fonts because I thought it would be really fun if they were all different numbers. Right? They're going to be numbers, but from different fonts. So I just tried to find some different fonts that looked cool. And I cut on my Cricut 2 copies from black craft foam, and they're approximately 2.5 inches tall, each of the numbers. And I just cut them out with my Cricut. And then when you're separating the craft foam, I found that the best way to do it is to just sort of pull at the seams, pull gently. And you want to make sure you don't distort your shape when you do that. And letterpress letters are on blocks. So I got out all my scrap wood. I have a bunch of paint stir sticks here, but they were mostly too small. The only numbers that they were big enough for were my 1s in the 12, and I'm only doing 12, 3, 6, and 9. So I used a paint stir stick or a piece of a paint stir stick for the 1. But for the other numbers, I have these little pieces of wood that are from the Dollar Tree, again from the crafting section, and those were the right size for my other numbers. So I just marked on them where the numbers would fit with, you know, a little bit of a border around each number, and then I cut them. And this wood is super easy to cut. This is probably the easiest wood I've ever cut. And then I sanded them, and I was very heavy-handed on the edges. I wanted them to look worn, so I wore down the corners. And then I cleaned them up, wiped them down, and I'm going to give them a sort of a stained look. So I've watered down some brown paint here, and the Folk Art Home Decor chalk paint in Java I thought was a good color. It's a dark brown. I had started with the burnt umber, but I felt it was too light. Watered that down, brushed it over, and wiped it off. But ultimately, I decided I wanted them even darker, and I ended up later washing them over with black several times, but I did this after I had already adhered the numbers to them. So it's better if you do it now, so you don't have to do it later. However, I'll also say this, you may not want to use all the colors that I use, you might want to do something different. So you can always add darker color, you can't always take it back. So I started with this brown. And once that stain had dried, I used the clear Gorilla Glue to adhere the numbers to the blocks. And I cut 2 of each to give them some height. So I adhered one to the block, and then I adhered the other. And again, you put the clear Gorilla Glue on one side and water on the other, and tried to line them up as best I could. It is pretty tacky, so after it starts to dry just a little bit, you can sort of push them into place and they stay pretty well. Now I wanted to make this piece a little less monochromatic, so I wanted to put some paint on the numbers to look like they had been inked, but not black. So I have some salmon colored chalk paint here. It's just a paint color that I like, and I'm going to apply it with a cotton ball because I didn't want a brushstroke look. So I just dabbed some of that onto a cotton ball and rubbed it over all of the numbers. And I had to do several passes over each number because as it dried, it did fade a little bit. And then I decided I wanted to give it just a little more highlight. So I took some of the colors that I had used in the rust and mixed them with the salmon paint. And the one I liked the most was the Sunny Day Yellow. And I just brushed that over each number just a little bit to give a little bit more highlight and brightness. But you can see here with the brown paint how the color of the numbers just doesn't pop against the piece of wood. So this is why I brushed over each piece of wood with black. And I did a couple of layers of black to get a color that I liked against the salmon color of the numbers. So now we need to attach these numbers to the clock. What I'm going to do is use the clear Gorilla Glue to attach the wood block to the edge of the pizza tray. Now this is higher than the wood, so it allows the second hand to sweep under the 6, which is my largest number, and it would interfere with the second hand if it were on the piece of wood. But because the edge of the pizza tray is higher, the 6 is over where the second hand sweeps. So all of the numbers are a little bit elevated over the wood. So I'm just attaching them to the edge with the clear Gorilla Glue and clamping them overnight. And we're so close to done now. We only need to hang it. And in a way, I guess it's kind of good that I have my wood weirdly, because I am going to be able to drill a hole in that sort of top right piece of wood that I can put over a screw that's in the wall. But if I had done the wood the way I think I should have, which is vertically, then I would have attached a piece of wire across the 2 pieces of wood, and that would have been better for balance, I think. I was just lucky that that left top corner of that top piece of wood was in the right location for me to drill a hole and hang this clock. But that's it, it's done and it works. I'm actually pretty pleased with how it came out, but I would love to know what you think. Please tell me in the comments. I would love to know what you would have done differently. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.